Our guest today is an author of a book that took the Elvis world by storm when it was published just a few years ago. It's called Destined To Die Young by Sally A. Hoedel. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I'm not overstating it when I say it took the Elvis fan community by storm, because I loiter on these message boards and I follow this stuff on social media. And your book has really resonated with people. There have been so many books written about nearly every aspect of Elvis Presley's life. Yours is so different because you look back at generations in Elvis Presley's family and hereditary issues that led to a number of health problems. What made you decide to go down this particular road?
It really is, radically different from anything that's been written before. And now in retrospect, I see what a risk that was, in publishing and writing the book. And like you said, it has been embraced by the Elvis community and even outside of it. And that's been a really beautiful thing to be a part of, because there's no guarantee, when you write a book, that anyone outside of the people that you're related to will read it. So Sure. That's been just really incredible. But I am a lifelong Elvis fan. I'm also a journalist. I have a journalism degree from Michigan State University, and this was my first book. And as a fan, even as a kid, reading the books, I always kind of left each one with more questions than answers. And I was always left with that thought of, why does Gladys, his mother, die at a similar age? She's 46, Elvis is 42. Similar 4-year period of degenerative health. Like, why is that when she's not taking the medication that Elvis takes? And she doesn't have the pressures, of being a rock and roll star like Elvis does, right. Even though it was obviously a lot of pressure being his mother and watching all that huge fame come to be. But that question kind of always stuck with me. And when I discovered in reading a book as an adult, maybe 6-7 years ago, that his maternal grandparents were first cousins, I just kind of sat back with that thought for a little bit, like, what if that's the reason why? What if they do share similar health issues, and maybe they were genetic, and maybe that first cousin marriage so close in that family tree, really played a part. So I thought, well, I'm going to look into it. I'm going to do some research. I'm going to read everything I can. And, it turns out that Elvis's health issues are kind of like a little blurb in every book. But when you put all that together, it's quite a bit of information. And when you look at the family tree, especially in relation to Gladys, she dies at 46, and she has 3 brothers who die 46 and 52, I think, and 58, early 50s. And then when it gets to Elvis, and it's all heart, lung, liver-related issues. So there's a lot happening in that family tree.
Was there an aha moment for you? And I say that because I've often wondered about it myself. People are very quick to say, well, listen, Elvis Presley died obviously because he was over-medicated. But there's no shortage of celebrities in the same situation as Elvis Presley who over-medicate, but they don't develop lung issues and heart issues and glaucoma and kidney problems.
And often geriatric-type diseases in a very young man, you know? So that was kind of the first, what is that about? And it is a lot. By the time he passes in 1977, he has disease or disorder in 9 of the 11 systems of the body. Again, by pop culture and history, long written off as the end result of prescription medication abuse. And Elvis absolutely had a problem with it. The book does not sugarcoat that. He did develop a problem. Even the things he took that he had to take had tolerance and addiction level issues, and they didn't understand some of the medication they were giving for different things at that time either. Right. But issues in 9 of the 11 systems of the body, and my research proves that at least 5 of them were present prior to fame, most likely since birth, so they couldn't have been caused by the medication. So that was really, another aha moment of this guy, after a certain point, really struggles physically to be Elvis Presley on a daily basis and to tour like he did in the 70s, without question.
Yeah, and your book explains that really well. I mean, this is not a book tracing Elvis Presley's performing career, but you do make the point that considering all of this was going on internally, Elvis was suffering, no question about it, but he continued on. He continued to perform. And listen, Elvis, of course, had his critics then. He has his critics now. But it's just remarkable that he was able to even go out there and do it after a while.
Absolutely. And that was really the other aha moment for me, especially as a fan, a lifelong fan, and someone who appreciates the man and his efforts, so much, especially knowing all that he was dealing with physically, is that he really, first and foremost, saw himself as a provider. So when he decides at a very young age that if anyone's going to pull his family out of this dire level of poverty, it has to be him, he doesn't quite know how to ever stop doing that, even after he, reaches that level of fame and that level of success, because he's just keeps providing for more people. At first it's Vernon and Gladys, his parents, but then it's his cousins, aunts and uncles, the Memphis Mafia, their families, and then everybody they end up touring with. So, in the very end, Elvis is telling people, I'm sick, I don't feel good. And they say, stop, Elvis, take a break. You're touring more than ever, take a break. And he says, I can't. Too many people rely on me. So I think that's really the essence of who Elvis was. And unfortunately, I think that gets lost, especially in today's culture, where if we remember Elvis, it tends to be, the room in the house in which he died. And he's sideburns and jumpsuits, and we're not focused enough on his historical contribution. But then this real other underlying truth gets lost along the way, too.
We're talking with Sally A. Hoedel, author of the book Destined to Die Young, and the past few years have been pretty exciting for Elvis fans. We have your book, as we mentioned, also the Elvis movie, and now the latest iteration of Elvis is this animated series, Agent Elvis, on Netflix. I know you've talked about it on social media, and I've mentioned it a few places as well. Setting aside any of the controversy regarding language and violence, my criticism of Agent Elvis is that I just don't think it's very good. I don't think it's well written. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, part of the reason I wanted to write my book, and it's been out for a couple of years, it just kind of keeps growing, because it resonates with people, and I think it makes sense to people. It answers those questions like we talked about, that it just makes Elvis make a little more sense, and it makes his choices make more sense. So within those 2 years, we had the movie come out and now Agent Elvis. But the reason I wrote the book in the first place was really to restore Elvis's humanity, to say this was a man, a human being. And his story is not one of self-destruction. And it is definitely a story of survival. And, first through extreme poverty, then extreme fame, and then these medical issues that no one has really known about or talked about. So to put all that effort into restoring his humanity and then seeing this cartoon, which I think Elvis, I just don't think he should be animated in the first place because of that humanity issue, and trying to remember that he was a real person. And he is, my other goal is always that he is elevated to historical figure and not just rock and roll star, because I know that sex, drugs, and rock and roll is really interesting to people, but Elvis deserves so much more than that because he culturally shifted the universe. And that shift is still being felt 46 years after his death. So I think the animated series just chips away at that, and it reduces him to sideburns and jumpsuits and, again, just some of those rock and roll ideas, because there's a lot of drug use celebrated in that series. Right. And some other things that I personally would not attach the historical image of Elvis Presley to.
So getting back to restoring the humanity of Elvis, we talked about Elvis having all of these medical issues. And what could have been done to prolong his life? Well,
obviously, his lifestyle was a very, rock and roll is hard on anybody, right? The touring is hard on anyone. And I think that's why, we see that it's really hard on his body in the 50s. He has a hospitalization and some health issues, and then when he makes all those movies in the 60s, his health is a little more stable because his routine is more stable. And then in the 70s, when he's touring like crazy, more dates each year, than the one before, we see his health take a hit again. And so many people around him say, we were off tour and he's fine. A week into the tour and he's not good again. So obviously that tour plays a big part on his health. So the lifestyle, obviously, very hard. The other issue is that, even when Gladys passes in 1958 and when Elvis in 1977, so much of what's wrong with Elvis, they really don't understand yet, and they don't have the equipment to diagnose it. So he has this huge colon problem, which is a lifelong problem, probably one of his biggest issues. And, even in 71, when he's still very active, he writes that he wants freedom from constipation. So it is infringing on him. He's in a lot of pain with that. And it's amazing that he was able to move on stage as long as he did. But you see in the later years, he doesn't move a lot. And I think that pain, was a big part of it. But all they had to diagnose it at that time was an X-ray. They didn't have a CAT scan yet. They didn't have an MRI. Both those things came around in the early 80s. So they didn't know how bad his colon was until the autopsy. And that comes, directly from his nurse, who, of course, I interviewed for the book. He has, the heart issue and the liver issue, which is related to his mother. Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is a inherited disorder that can affect your lungs or your liver. I believe, without question, that's what happened to Gladys, because she died of liver disease, and her doctor always said, it looks like hepatitis, but I can't really quite figure out what it is. So I believe it was that Alpha-1 issue. Of course, she's always pegged as this lifelong alcoholic because of the cirrhosis and whatnot, but it was really this genetic liver disease. So again, that was not understood when she passed, and it was barely understood when Elvis passed. So much of it is timing, and medical advancement.
So here's a strange question for you. Nowadays, we do have the medical know-how to diagnose and treat these various different conditions that Elvis was suffering from. But as I mentioned, he was over-medicating. It's no secret. As a result, there is a contingent out there who will just refuse to accept anything else other than that, and they almost celebrate Elvis Presley's drug abuse as a way to diminish him. I don't know what it is about Elvis. He's always been, right from the beginning, this controversial figure, and there's always this segment of rock fans who want to bring him down. I mean, he seems like the nicest guy in the world. I don't know why they would want to do it.
It is strange, and maybe it's because he has so many supporters that are so seriously committed to supporting him. Yet there's always that
right.
opposite, reaction.
Sure.
So maybe that's part of it. But I do think it's fascinating that the drug use of the Beatles gets glorified and celebrated as something needed to be creative in the way that they were. Jimi Hendrix, again, people like that get celebrated, or not celebrated, but they don't get reduced because of their dependency problems, where Elvis has always been reduced for that for some reason. And I do think it's because he died in the bathroom. I think that has always been kind of tabloid fodder that has grown and become a part of pop culture. And I think the Geraldo special, in the late 70s did not help. Like Elvis had passed, and all of a sudden there was all this controversy around him. And for kids, who were 10 and 12 at the time, they weren't hearing about this phenomenal person who changed the world in 1954 and through 56, and really changed music as we know it. They were hearing Elvis Presley died from drugs in the bathroom. And I think generationally that has come up.
Can we talk for a moment about Lisa Marie Presley?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about Lisa Marie's history. Obviously, it's incredibly tragic, but also shocking to so many people because she was just at Graceland for this event only a few days before.
Sure.
I don't think anything has really been released at the time that we're speaking about this regarding why Lisa Marie Presley passed away, or what are your thoughts on that? Having just written, naturally I'm going to have to ask you about it.
Yeah, sure. And it's something I really haven't spoken to much just because I don't want to hypothesize, right? I don't want to add to a conversation that we don't know enough about yet to have. And when we do know enough, I absolutely want to have it. I think it's important. But I will say that I was there for birthday celebration. I saw Lisa. She spoke to the crowd. She spent probably an hour or more going from fan to fan and talking to them, taking a picture, signing autographs, just very gracious. So to see that, and I was in Memphis for that, and then I was back in Memphis 2 weeks later for her memorial. And it was hard to believe. It's still hard to believe. So again, we know that she had some substance abuse issues in the past. I don't know, what her recent history or behavior is or was. But I think no matter what it was, we have to understand that she passed from cardiac arrest, as far as we know right now, at the age of 54, and we know there's a great deal of heart disease and young death in that family, and that can't be overlooked either, no matter what the final outcome is of all this.
So let's move on to a lighter topic. Some might say it's lighter than air. Destined to Fly, the story of Ron Strauss. First of all, how did you discover this story and decide you wanted to tell this story?
Well, it's funny because at one point in time, Destined to Die Young was just kind of a brain candy project for me. That's something that I did on the side, as a writer, as a journalist, as an Elvis fan. Like, I'm going to look into this and see what comes of it, and maybe it'll be an ebook or something, right? And, of course, I started interviewing people who knew Elvis, and there was so much evidence and so much amazing stuff kept falling in my lap that it became a real project, with a lot of financial backing behind it for editing and layout and printing and marketing and all that, right? Because it was such important information. But the first person I met in the Elvis world was Ron Strauss, the co-pilot of the Lisa Marie. And I live in northern Michigan, and he lives in Florida. But to escape the Florida heat in the summer, he would spend the summers in northern Michigan. So I got connected with him because someone knew I was working on this little side project. And we sat down together, and of course, as the pilot of the Lisa Marie, he had no information at all to offer me on Elvis's health issues.
Right.
But he was so inspiring because we just, we spent like 8 hours together that first day, and it just clicked. Like, we had a lot in common. He's just a really good guy, and he has a really incredible story. So I give him a lot of the credit for propelling Destined to Die Young forward, to make it a real research project where I went to Memphis and Tupelo a number of times and interviewed people who knew Elvis because Ron was so nice to me and so gracious. And then, of course, getting to know him, going to Memphis with him as well, for birthdays and Elvis Week and all that. His story is amazing. So he spent 12 years in the Air Force. He was kicked out of Catholic school, first of all. And when he was a sophomore, he was called into the office, and they said, "We don't think school's for you," which is crazy to think now. But he says, they were right. I liked girls and football. That was it. So he went home and told his parents, and they weren't happy, of course. But they signed for him to join the Air Force underage because he knew he loved planes. Of course, he knew he would never fly them because now he doesn't even have a high school diploma, right? So he joins the Air Force, flies. He starts out as a mechanic, advances to flight engineer, 12 years, 3,400 hours during the Vietnam War he flew. And then he leaves the Air Force because he wants to be a pilot, and that's the only way he can do it. Works his way up again through airlines. He's hijacked once in Nicaragua, and he becomes Elvis Presley's pilot, too. So it really is a Americana, Flights of Americana. There's some John Wayne in there, and some Elvis, and it's an amazing story.
Yeah, with girls, football, and the military, I would see where Elvis would get along well with Ron. Yeah.
They had a lot in common, and, there's so many parallels because Ron grew up in Fonda, Iowa, which is a very tiny town, and no one expected him to be the most successful citizen to come out of that town, just like I don't think anyone expected Elvis Presley to emerge out of Tupelo, Mississippi, to be the most famous person ever known.
Right. So if people were interested in, and hopefully they are, both of these books, they can go to a website, and I have it. It's elvisauthor.com.
Absolutely, and if you order from there, the books will be signed, and of course it's on Amazon too, if that's easier for people. But with the website, all the books are signed. Considering
there have been, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this interview, this is the ultimate callback. At the very beginning of this interview, I mentioned all of these books that have been written over the years about Elvis Presley. So how is it that you managed to get a website called elvisauthor.com? How is that even available?
Well, I believe in a thing called Elvis magic. I have to tell you, he brings people together from around the world still, and I have met some of the greatest people I've known through Elvis, Elvis fans, and of course people who knew Elvis, and that's just all been a lovely gift of this whole project.
Well, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. It's a fascinating book. I have to be honest, I'm still reading Destined to Die Young. I have not gone into the second one yet, but I soon will. But I thank you so much for appearing on the show, and I encourage everybody to read this book, and you'll get a better sense of who Elvis was, the kind of person he was, and what he had to deal with, which doesn't get talked about all that often. So you've done some fine work here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I always say, all you have to bring to the table is an open mind, and I do think you'll walk away feeling a little bit differently about Elvis Presley.